I came home from my daughter's wedding expecting quiet. Maybe a little mess from being gone a few days, but not this, not a backyard that looked like someone had taken a chainsaw to my life. 3 trees, 3 massive white oaks that had been there longer than anyone alive on my street, were gone. Just gone. All that was left were jagged stumps, pale sawdust, and that raw, open silence you get when something ancient disappears overnight. And the worst part, I already knew exactly who did it. Her name wasn't Amanda. Around here, we knew her as Claire Whitmore, though she preferred Dr. Whitmore, always with that little pause, like she expected the title to echo. Cosmetic surgeon, drove a pearl white Range Rover, wore sunglasses even when it was cloudy, and about 2 years ago, she bought the old Halstead property next door, tore down a perfectly good 1920s craftsman house, and replaced it with this glass and concrete thing that looked like it belonged on the side of a cliff in Malibu, not tucked into a quiet historic hillside in Northern California. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who complains about change. Neighborhoods evolve, people rebuild. That's life. But there's a difference between building something new and bulldozing everything that gave a place its soul. And Claire, she didn't just build a house, she built a statement. Floor-to-ceiling glass, imported stone, a pool that seemed to spill off the edge of the hill like it was trying to impress someone miles away, and every decision she made after that felt like she was trying to erase anything that didn't fit her version of perfect, including my trees. Those oaks, they weren't just landscaping. My grandfather used to tell me they were planted sometime in the 1890s, back when this hillside was mostly orchards and dirt roads. I grew up climbing them, built my first treehouse between the 2 closest trunks. My daughter carved her initials into one when she was 10, something I pretended to be mad about, but secretly loved. They shaded half my yard in the summer, dropped acorns like clockwork in the fall, and if you stood under them at dusk, you could hear birds settling in like it was their own little city up there. And Claire, she hated them. At first, it was subtle, little comments when we'd run into each other at the mailbox or at the edge of the driveway. "Those trees must block a lot of your light," she'd say, tilting her head like she was concerned. Or, "Have you ever thought about trimming them back? They cast quite a shadow over my pool area in the afternoon." Always polite, always smiling. But there was something underneath it, like she wasn't asking, she was testing how far she could push. One afternoon, maybe 6 months before all this happened, she came over while I was out back raking leaves. She had on this perfectly tailored workout outfit, not a wrinkle on it, and she stood there looking up at the branches like they personally offended her. "You know," she said, crossing her arms, "I had a specialist come take a look at these. Certified arborist. He says they're starting to show structural issues." I leaned on the rake and just looked at her. "Structural issues," I repeated. She nodded. "Internal rot, potential limb failure. Honestly, it's a liability. If one of those branches falls into my yard, or worse, onto someone, it could be a serious problem." I let that sit for a second, then shrugged. "They've been standing here over 100 years. I think they're doing all right." She smiled, but it was thinner now. "Well, I'd be happy to cover the cost of having them properly managed. Pruned, maybe even partially reduced. It would really improve the sight lines from my pool." There it was. Not about safety, not really. About her view. "I'm not cutting them," I said, simple as that. Her jaw tightened just a fraction. "You should at least consider it. It would benefit both of us." "I already did," I said. Answer still no. She held my gaze a second longer than comfortable, then gave this little laugh like none of it mattered. "All right, your property." But the way she turned and walked back, I remember thinking, this isn't over. Over the next few months, the comments didn't stop. If anything, they got sharper, less disguised. She'd mention how much she invested in her home, how certain obstructions affected property value, how the neighborhood was evolving, and some people needed to adapt. A couple of neighbors even told me she'd been asking around, trying to find out if anyone else had issues with my trees. Nobody did, because everybody knew those trees. They were part of the street, part of the identity of the place. Kids waited for the school bus under them. People walking their dogs would stop in the shade during hot afternoons. In the spring, when the leaves came in thick and green, the whole yard felt cooler, calmer, like stepping into a different pocket of time. And then, I left for the weekend. My daughter, Emily, had her wedding out in Sonoma. Small vineyard ceremony, nothing flashy, just family and close friends. It was one of those weekends you wish you could freeze, laughter, music, the kind of happiness that feels earned. I turned my phone off for most of it, didn't check emails, didn't think about the house, didn't think about Claire or her complaints or anything waiting back home. For 3 days, everything was perfect. And then I pulled into my driveway Sunday afternoon. At first, I thought I'd come to the wrong house. The light was wrong, too bright. The air felt exposed. And then I saw it. No canopy, no shadows, just open sky where there used to be layers of branches. I got out of the car slowly, like if I moved too fast it might make it real, and walked toward the backyard. Each step felt heavier than it should have, like my body already knew what my brain was trying to catch up to. And then I turned the corner, and there it was. 3 stumps, wide as tables, fresh cuts still bleeding sap. Piles of sawdust scattered across the ground like someone had dumped sand everywhere. Tire tracks carved through the grass. Broken branches, shredded leaves, and that smell, that sharp, green smell of freshly cut wood that hits you in the back of your throat. I just stood there, didn't say anything, didn't move. I don't know how long, a minute, maybe 5. And then, I heard her voice. Well, it really opens things up, doesn't it? I turned slowly, and there she was standing on the edge of her property by that ridiculous infinity pool, drink in hand, sunglasses on, like she was watching a sunset instead of the aftermath of something she'd just destroyed. "What did you do?" I said, my voice quieter than I expected. She took a sip, then lowered the glass. "Oh, those trees. They had to come down. They were hazardous." I stared at her. "You cut down my trees." "They were a risk," she said, shrugging. "My arborist confirmed it. Structural instability, disease. Honestly, I did you a favor." "A favor?" I repeated. She smiled again, that same thin smile. "You're welcome." And right there, standing in the middle of what used to be my backyard, something shifted. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that, but something colder, sharper. Because in that moment, I realized she didn't think she'd done anything wrong. And people like that, they don't stop unless something makes them. I didn't yell, not right away, which, looking back, probably unsettled her more than if I had. I just stood there, staring at those stumps, then back at her, trying to understand how someone could do something like this and still look relaxed. Like this was just another upgrade on her property checklist. "You went onto my land," I said finally, slow, measured, and removed 3 protected trees without my permission. She tilted her head slightly, like she was listening to a child explain something obvious. "I had authorization," she replied, tapping the rim of her glass with one manicured finger. "Emergency removal." The trees were unsafe. I let out a breath through my nose, a short, humorless one. "Emergency," I repeated, glancing around at the clean cuts, the heavy equipment tracks, the fact that this had clearly taken hours, maybe an entire crew. Funny how that emergency waited until I was out of town. That got a flicker, just a flicker, of something in her expression, but it disappeared fast. "Timing is irrelevant," she said. "Safety isn't." And that was it. That was the moment I knew talking to her like a reasonable neighbor wasn't going to get me anywhere. So I turned, walked back into my house, grabbed my phone, and started making calls. First the city forestry department, left a message. Then zoning, then the non-emergency police line. I even called a guy I knew who'd done landscaping work in the neighborhood for years. Asked him if he'd heard anything, if any crews had been scheduled nearby. By the time the sun started dipping, I had a handful of callbacks, and none of them made me feel better. The city confirmed there had been a permit filed. Expedited emergency clearance due to structural hazard. It had supporting documentation, photos, an arborist report, everything stamped and processed. If it was fraud, the woman on the phone told me, her voice sympathetic but tired, "It'll take time to investigate." Time. That word kept coming up. Time to review, time to verify, time to challenge. Meanwhile, my trees were already gone. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table, staring out the window at that empty space where shade used to be, and for a second, I felt it, that helplessness. That feeling like someone had already won because they moved faster, hired better lawyers, filled out the right paperwork before you even knew there was a game being played. And then, something clicked. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, just a quiet memory pushing its way forward. My Aunt Margaret. She passed a few years back, but she used to live up on this same hillside, back when most of it was still untouched. Botanist, real one, not the kind Claire hires to rubber stamp a decision. Margaret spent decades cataloging native species around here, working with conservation groups, fighting to get parts of this area designated as protected land. I remembered being a kid, sitting at her dining table while she spread out maps and documents, explaining how ecosystems weren't just patches of green. They were networks, fragile, interconnected, and once you broke them, you couldn't just replace them with imported plants and call it even. After she died, I inherited a bunch of her files, boxes of notes, surveys, legal documents, most of which I'd never really gone through in detail. They were still in my garage. So that night, I went digging. Dusty boxes, old folders, papers yellowed at the edges, and for a while it felt like I was just grasping at anything that might give me some leverage. But then I found it. A thick binder labeled Hillside Conservation Easement, 1978. Inside were maps of the entire neighborhood, marked with zones, annotations about native species, migration patterns, and then a section specifically on old-growth oaks. Not just as trees, but as keystone structures. Habitat, nesting sites, food sources. I sat there flipping through pages, my heart starting to pick up, because the language wasn't just environmental, it was legal. There were references to federal protections, to species that depended on these trees, species listed under conservation statutes that carried serious weight. And suddenly, the scope of what Claire had done shifted. This wasn't just about my property anymore. This wasn't a neighbor dispute. This was bigger, a lot bigger. I spent the rest of the night cross-referencing everything. Old documents with current regulations, conservation maps with property lines. I pulled up federal guidelines, read through sections I probably would have ignored any other day, but now every line felt like a piece of a puzzle snapping into place. By 2 in the morning, I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew. Those trees, the ones she called hazardous, they weren't just protected locally. They were part of a designated habitat system tied to species that fell under federal protection, which meant no one, no matter how much money they had, no matter what paperwork they pushed through at the city level, could legally remove them without a whole different level of review. Impact studies, federal permits, oversight, none of which she had. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since I got home, I felt something other than anger. I felt clarity, because Claire hadn't just crossed a line. She'd blown past it at full speed, assuming no one would ever connect the dots. The next morning, I got to work. I took photos everything. The stumps, the debris, the tire tracks, even close-ups of broken nests I found in the branches left behind. Then I scanned Margaret's documents, the relevant sections, the maps, the legal language tying everything together. I organized it all, timelines, evidence, notes. And then I started making calls again, but this time, different ones. Federal Wildlife Services, Environmental Protection Offices, state conservation agencies. I wasn't leaving voicemails anymore. I was sending documentation, emails with attachments, detailed reports. By noon, I'd filed formal complaints with 3 separate agencies. And then, I waited. Claire, meanwhile, carried on like nothing had happened. That afternoon, I saw her out by the pool again, talking to a contractor, gesturing toward the now unobstructed view like she was presenting a finished masterpiece. At one point, she caught me looking and gave a small, satisfied nod, like this was over. Like she'd won. I didn't nod back. I just watched her for a second, then went back inside. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't see yet, was that the game she thought she was playing, it had just changed completely. Monday morning, around 9 a.m., I heard the first vehicle pull up. Not a contractor, not a landscaper, government plates. Then another, and another. I stepped outside just as 2 people in field gear were getting out, followed by a man in a suit carrying a clipboard. They didn't knock on my door first. They walked straight to the backyard. Claire noticed too. I saw her come out onto her patio, confusion written all over her face as she watched them move past the property line, examining the stumps, taking photos, speaking quietly among themselves. She set her drink down this time. No sunglasses. No smile. "Excuse me," she called out, walking toward them. "What exactly is going on here?" One of the agents turned, calm, professional. "Ma'am, we're here in response to a report of potential destruction of protected habitat." You could almost hear the shift, like the air itself tightened. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly. Those trees were removed under emergency authorization. I have documentation. We'll review all documentation, the man replied. But at this time, we need you to step back while we complete our assessment. And for the first time since I'd met her, Claire Whitmore looked uncertain, not defeated, not yet, but the confidence, that unshakable certainty she carried like armor. It cracked, just a little. And standing there, watching it happen, I realized something else. This wasn't going to be quick. It wasn't going to be simple, but it was going to hit her a lot harder than she ever expected. By noon, there were more vehicles, more people, clipboards, measuring tools, cameras, quiet conversations that carried just enough for you to know this wasn't routine. They moved methodically, like they'd done this 100 times before, documenting everything Claire had tried to erase in a single weekend. And the whole time, she hovered at the edge of her patio, arms crossed, phone pressed to her ear, pacing in tight, controlled circles like she was trying to outwalk the problem. I caught bits of what she was saying. Miscommunication, overreach. I have permits, and then, at one point, sharper, more urgent. No, you don't understand. This is going to affect the entire project. That word, project, said everything. To her, this wasn't a home, or a neighborhood, or a shared space people had roots in. It was a project, an investment, something to be optimized. And now, for the first time, something wasn't bending to her timeline. One of the agents eventually walked over to me, introduced himself, asked me to walk him through what I knew. I showed him Margaret's documents, explained the history of the trees, the conservation designation, how long they'd been part of that ecosystem. He listened without interrupting, flipping through the pages slowly, nodding every so often, and when he looked up, there was no ambiguity in his expression. These should never have been removed without federal review, he said. Simple, flat, final. That was the moment it stopped being a question. They spent the rest of the afternoon extending their inspection beyond my yard, onto Claire's property. Her landscaping, the grading around her pool, the retaining walls, the imported plants that looked good in a magazine but didn't belong on that hillside. Every shovel of dirt she'd moved over the last 2 years suddenly mattered. Around 3 o'clock, a second group arrived state level this time. More serious faces, more paperwork. Claire tried again, this time more forceful, stepping directly into their path. You're trespassing, she snapped. You need to leave until my attorney is present. The man she was speaking to didn't raise his voice, didn't react to the tone. Ma'am, based on preliminary findings, this property is now part of an active environmental investigation. We are authorized to proceed. And just like that, she stepped back. Not because she wanted to, but because for once, she didn't have the leverage. The next few days blurred together, reports, follow-ups, more inspections. I stayed out of their way for the most part, answered questions when asked, provided whatever documentation they needed. Claire, she went from defensive to aggressive to quiet. You could see it happening in stages. The contractors stopped showing up. The landscaping crew vanished. Even the lights around her pool, the ones she used to keep on late into the night, went dark. About a week later, the official notices came in. Thick envelopes, multiple agencies, language that didn't leave much room for interpretation. I wasn't the one they were addressed to, but word travels fast in a neighborhood like ours. By the time I got a copy of the summary from one of the investigators, the story had already started spreading. They classified what she'd done as destruction of protected habitat, not just because of my trees, but because those trees were part of a larger ecological network that her entire renovation had been chipping away at for 2 years. The pool excavation, the grading, the replacement of native growth with imported species, it all added up. Piece by piece, decision by decision, she'd been dismantling something she didn't even realize was protected at a level far above local zoning boards. The order was comprehensive. Restore the land to its natural state. Remove non-native installations. Replant with approved species. Submit to ongoing environmental monitoring. And then there was the fine, $200,000. I remember reading that number twice, not because I felt sorry for her, but because it finally matched the scale of what she'd done. You don't erase 100 years overnight and walk away like it's nothing. The pool, the centerpiece of her entire view, had to go. Drained, dismantled, filled in. The edge that used to overlook the valley, replaced with soil, then seedlings, then time. It took weeks, Trucks came in, equipment tore out what had just been built, and for a while, her yard looked worse than mine had that first day, stripped down, raw, exposed. There's a strange kind of symmetry in that. My trees, they were gone for good. Nothing was bringing them back. But the damage didn't stop with me, and the consequences didn't stop with her. Federal programs kicked in to restore my side of the property. Soil treatment, new plantings, younger oaks grown from local stock that, given enough time, would carry on what had been lost. It wasn't the same, it never will be, but it was something. And the protections around the area, they got stronger. Updated classifications, tighter oversight. Ironically, my property value went up. Not because of what happened, but because now it was guaranteed that nothing like that could happen again. Claire's Place went the other direction. Fast. Buyers aren't interested in properties tied up in long-term environmental monitoring, with restrictions on what you can and can't touch, with a history that reads like a legal case file. She listed it, dropped the price, dropped it again. Every time a potential buyer got close, the same thing happened. They walked. Too complicated. Too many strings attached. About 6 months after all this started, a moving truck showed up. No announcement, no goodbye. Just quiet packing, a few days of activity, and then she was gone. Someone told me she moved into a penthouse downtown, somewhere with no trees, no soil, nothing she couldn't control. The house sat empty for a while after that, a shell of what it was supposed to be. Eventually, it sold for a lot less than she put into it. And just like that, the whole thing ended. Or at least, the part people could see. Because for me, it didn't really end. Every time I walk into my backyard, I still notice the difference. The light hits differently. The air feels more open, but not in a good way. There's a space where something used to be, something that took generations to grow and a single decision to erase. And I think about that moment when she stood there, drink in hand, telling me she'd done me a favor. Maybe in her world, that made sense. Clear the view. Increase the value. Remove the obstacle. But what she didn't understand, what a lot of people don't, is that not everything in life is there to be optimized. Some things are there because they've earned their place over time, because they hold stories, shade, history, things you can't measure on a property report. She thought cutting down 3 trees would improve her view. Instead, it changed everything. Not just for her, but for the entire neighborhood. And I'll be honest, I still go back and forth on it. Part of me feels like justice was served, that what happened to her was exactly what should have happened. But another part of me wonders if it had to go that far. If there was a version of this where someone stepped in earlier, where it didn't end with everything she built being torn back down. I don't know. Maybe that's the question. When someone crosses a line like that, knowingly or not, what's the right response? Where does accountability end and punishment begin? I'd be curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have handled it differently? Let me know in the comments, because I've been living with that question ever since.